March 22, 1945, 2,200 hours. Nierstein, Germany. Lieutenant Irvin Jacobs. The moon hung fat and bright over the Rhine, turning the water silver. Jacobs crouched in the lead assault boat, knuckles white around the paddle shaft, listening to the canvas hull scrape against gravel as engineers shoved them toward the current. 8 men behind him. No artillery barrage. No smoke screen. No fanfare. Just wood, canvas, and nerve. This wasn't supposed to happen tonight. 12 hours ago, Major General Stafford Leroy Irwin had protested to the 12th Corps commander, Major General Manton, Eddie, that a crossing by nightfall was impossible, that his 5th Infantry Division couldn't execute a well-planned and ordered crossing on such short notice. Eddie had passed the objection up to Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding 3rd Army. Patton's reply came back like a whip crack. Get some sort of bridgehead. Some sort of bridgehead was all he wanted. Because 24 hours from now at dawn on March 24th, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery's 21st Army Group would launch Operation Plunder, the most meticulously planned river crossing since D-Day, involving 2 airborne divisions, 3,500 artillery pieces, 25 divisions, and the personal attendance of Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself. Montgomery had spent 6 months preparing. He had invited the world's press. He had orchestrated it like a symphony. And George Patton intended to beat him across by a full day. Jacobs felt the current grip the boat. Cold water hissed along the sides. The far-banked German-held territory, the last natural barrier protecting the Reich, loomed 900 feet away. Behind him, in the darkness of Nierstein's ruined streets, 500 more assault boats waited with the rest of Colonel Paul J. Black's 11th Infantry Regiment. 13 battalions of artillery stood ready to fire on American call, but they had been ordered silent. Surprise mattered more than firepower tonight. The paddle bit water. Jacobs could hear his own breath, the soft grunt of men rowing, the slap of the Rhine against canvas. No searchlights. No machine gun fire. No German voices shouting alarm. Nothing. They were halfway across when Jacobs allowed himself to think, we might actually make it. The boat's bow scraped mud. Jacobs vaulted over the side, boots sinking into German soil, rifle up. His men fanned out in silence, scanning the tree line. A shape moved 30 yards ahead, a German sentry turning, mouth opening to shout. Hand ho, Jacobs hissed. The German's hands shot up, then another, then 5 more. 7 Wehrmacht soldiers, stunned and surrendering, their eyes wide in the moonlight. One of them, hands trembling, climbed into an empty assault boat and paddled himself back across the Rhine without escort. By midnight, all 3 battalions of the 11th Infantry were across. 20 casualties. No artillery preparation. No air support. No elaborate plan. Just Patton's audacity, and the Rhine crossed in silence while the world slept. 300 miles to the northwest, in a command caravan near the Dutch-German border, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery reviewed the final details of Operation Plunder. Maps covered every surface. Liaison officers shuttled between rooms. The plan was immaculate. Synchronized assaults across a 35-kilometer front. Amphibious vehicles, the largest single-day airborne operation since Normandy. Churchill would arrive in hours to witness it. Montgomery had argued for months that a premature, poorly coordinated Rhine crossing would risk disaster and dilute Allied strength. He had insisted to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, that only a single overwhelming set-piece operation, his operation, could guarantee success. The Americans, he believed, lacked the discipline for such precision. He had no idea that, at that very moment, American soldiers were already on the East Bank. By 0600 hours on March 23rd, Patton, 5th Division, had 4 regiments across the Rhine and was pushing 6 miles inland toward the town of Grosgaro. Attached tanks and tank destroyers began crossing by ferry. A Class 40 treadway bridge opened by late afternoon. Engineers tore down fences along the main highway and widened it to 3 lanes, one direction only, east. Patton himself arrived at the crossing site mid-morning, striding to the riverbank with his trademark ivory-handled revolvers and a grin that could cut glass. He stood there for a long moment, hands on hips, watching his men and machines pour across. Then he did something no general had done in 140 years. He urinated in the Rhine. "I've been waiting for this," Patton said to an aide, zipping his trousers. He turned and shouted to the engineers widening the road. The Germans said it couldn't be crossed. "Well, we just pissed in it." But Patton wasn't finished. He wanted the world to know, and he wanted Montgomery to know first. At 1,000 hours, Patton telephoned 12th Army Group Commander General Omar Bradley at his headquarters in Luxembourg City. "Brad," Patton said, voice electric with triumph, "don't tell anyone, but I'm across." "I'll be damned," Bradley replied. "Keep it quiet," Patton urged. "Wait until tomorrow to announce it. I don't want the Germans to know yet." But by late afternoon, Patton called again. This time his tone had shifted. He wanted headlines. He wanted glory. He wanted Montgomery and the world to see what American speed. "Brad," Patton said, "I want the world to know that Third Army." Bradley understood. He understood the rivalry. He understood what this meant for American prestige, for the balance of Allied command, for the final drive into Germany. And perhaps he understood the satisfaction of stealing Montgomery's thunder. Bradley released the news to the press. The announcement was carefully timed. It broke just hours before Montgomery's massive Operation Plunder was set to begin at a moment calculated. Bradley later wrote, to take some of the luster 24th, as British and Canadian troops began their meticulously choreographed assault across the lower Rhine near Wesel. The BBC broadcast a pre-recorded speech by Winston Churchill praising the British forces for achieving. The 1st and 3rd Army staff officers listened to the broadcast and roared with laughter. The distinction, the glory, the historical footnote belonged not to Montgomery's 21st Army Group, but to Patton's 3rd Army. Bernard Law Montgomery, hero of El Alamein, architect of Operation Overlord's ground campaign, Britain's most celebrated field commander, weighed the American press releases with mounting fury. This wasn't just a military operation gone awry. This was a public humiliation, and Montgomery intended to make someone answer for it. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery sat at his desk, jaw clenched, reading the morning dispatches with the mechanical precision of a man trying to contain rage. Outside his command caravan, at 21st Army Group Tactical Headquarters in Venlo, Netherlands, the sounds of Operation Plunder's success echoed across the Rhine trucks rumbling, engineers shouting coordinates, the distant thump of artillery securing bridgeheads. By every military measure, the operation was a triumph. 80,000 troops across, and lines weren't about Montgomery. They were about George Patton. Montgomery's chief of staff, Major General Francis de Gingen, entered quietly, holding a stack of American and British newspapers. He didn't need to say anything. Montgomery simply extended his hand, took the papers, and read. "Patton beats Monty across Rhine," screamed the star. "He crosses without artillery. Seizes bridgehead before British operation begins," declared the Chicago Tribune. Even the London papers, with barely concealed admiration for American audacity. The carefully orchestrated narrative Montgomery had constructed that only methodical, overwhelming force could guarantee a successful Rhine. Cowboy general. Montgomery set the papers down with terror. De Gingen hesitated. "Sir, the Supreme Commander is currently—" "Now, Freddie." Within the hour, a coded message crackled over secure radio lines to Supreme Headquarters Allied expeditionary force in Reims, France. Montgomery demanded an immediate meeting with General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The subject, General George S. Patton, Jr., but Montgomery didn't wait for Eisenhower's reply. He drafted a second message. This one marked most urgent and addressed it directly to the Prime Minister. Winston Churchill had crossed the Rhine himself on March 26th, riding in an American LCVP landing craft alongside Montgomery and General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. The Prime Minister had been in high spirits, waving his trademark cigar, joking with soldiers, even urinating on the Siegfried Line defenses in a show of symbolic defiance. Photographers captured the moment. Churchill, grinning again. But when Montgomery's telegram reached Churchill later that evening, the message was blunt. Montgomery complained that Patton has unauthorized crossing announced with deliberate timing to overshadow. British operations represented a dangerous pattern of American grandstanding that jeopardizes command cohesion. He argued that Patton's recklessness endangered Allied strategy, that his insubordination to coordinated planning was intolerable, and that unless Eisenhower took decisive action, the entire command structure didn't explicitly demand Patton's dismissal in writing. He didn't have to. The implication was clear. Patton had to go. Churchill read the telegram twice, then back in his chair. He understood Montgomery's anger, understood it intimately. The Field Marshal was Britain's greatest living soldier, a man who had driven Rommel from Africa, who had held the left flank at Normandy, who had just executed the largest river crossing in modern warfare. And now, in the court of public opinion, he was being upstaged by a man Churchill himself had once described as, but Churchill also understood something Montgomery did not. The war was almost over, and politics had already begun. The Prime Minister summoned his personal secretary. "Draft a reply to Montgomery," he said, measured, sympathetic, but firm. Churchill knew that Patton, brash, profane, and politically toxic, was also irreplaceable. Third Army had raced farther and faster than any Allied force in Europe. German commanders feared him more than any other Allied general, often holding entire divisions in reserve, simply because they believed Patton might appear. To fire him now, in the final weeks of the war, would be more importantly. Churchill understood that Montgomery's complaint wasn't really about military coordination. It was about pride, about legacy, about who would be remembered as the architect of Germany's defeat. And Churchill, for all his loyalty to Britain's military heroes, was a realist. He dictated carefully, his words chosen with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating the egos of great men. The message acknowledged Montgomery's concerns, praised Operation Plunder's success, and then gently, almost paternally reminded the Field Marshal that the Americans were now the senior partner. Its treasury was empty. Its armies, though valiant, were shrinking while American divisions continued to pour into Europe. Churchill had spent the entire war managing the delicate balance between British pride and American power. The reply was sent within hours. Churchill's tone was warm, but unmistakable. "Drop it, Bernard." Montgomery received Churchill's response on March 27th. He read it once, then folded it and placed it in his desk drawer without comment. De Gingen, watching from across the room, saw the Field Marshal's jaw tighten. Montgomery said nothing. He simply returned to his maps. But the matter didn't end there. Because while Churchill was managing Montgomery, Eisenhower was dealing with an entirely different problem. Patton himself, at Third Army headquarters, and was celebrating. His staff had thrown together an impromptu party, nothing elaborate, just whiskey and cigars and the intoxicating taste of vindication. Patton stood in the center of the room, holding court, recounting the crossing with theatrical flair. He mimicked Bradley's voice on the phone. He laughed about the German, who paddled himself back across the Rhine. He speculated loudly about what Montgomery must be thinking right now. "I'll bet Monty's mustache is twitching. Patton said, grinning. "Probably sending cables to Ike right now, demanding my head on a pike." His staff laughed. But Patton's chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, didn't. Gay had been with Patton through North Africa, Sicily, and France. "Sir," Gay said quietly, after the others had left, "you might want to ease up on the press interviews for a few days." Patton waved him off. "Hell, Hop, we earned this. Exactly what I'm worried about, sir." Patton's eyes narrowed. He understood. He'd been here before after Sicily, after the slapping incidents. After every time his mouth or his ego had nearly ended his career, he knew Eisenhower was under pressure. He knew Montgomery carried weight with Churchill and the British High Command. He knew deep down that he was in disgrace. But he also knew something else. He was winning the war. And Patton believed, perhaps rightly, perhaps arrogantly, that results mattered more than protocol. "Hop," Patton said, pouring himself another whiskey. "If they fire me for crossing the Rhine too fast, then this whole damn war has been a waste." Gay said nothing. Because they both knew the truth. Patton could be right and still lose. At SHAEF headquarters in Reims, Eisenhower was already drafting his response to Montgomery's complaints. The Supreme Commander sat alone in his office, smoking one cigarette after another, staring at the pile of cables on his desk. Messages from Montgomery, messages from Bradley defending Patton, messages from Washington asking if there was a command crisis brewing. Eisenhower hated this. Hated the politics, hated the ego management, hated that two of his best commanders couldn't go a month without turning the war into a personal grudge match. But he also knew exactly what he was going to say. Because Eisenhower, unlike Montgomery or Patton, wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting to end the war as quickly as possible with as few casualties as possible. And if that meant tolerating Patton's theatrics and Montgomery's complaints, the message was addressed to Montgomery, with copies to Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff. It was diplomatic, measured, and utterly final. Eisenhower praised Operation Plunder. He acknowledged Montgomery's concerns. He noted that Third Army's crossing had been executed within its operational conflict. And then he added, in language unmistakable to anyone who read it, "General Patton remains in command of Third Army." The cable was transmitted on March 28th. Montgomery received it in silence, read it once, and filed it without reply. Patton never saw the telegram. He never knew how close Montgomery had come to demanding his dismissal, never knew that Churchill had quietly intervened, never knew that Eisenhower had spent 3 days managing a diplomatic firestorm while Third Army raced deeper into Germany. All Patton knew was this: he had crossed the Rhine first, beaten Montgomery, and gotten away with it. Again. But in London, in quiet conversations between Churchill and his military advisers, a different narrative was taking shape. The Americans were ascendant. British influence was waning. And the final chapters of the war, the ones that would determine the shape of post-war Europe, were being written not by Montgomery's meticulous planning, but by Patton's relentless drive east. The race for Berlin had begun, and Patton, whether Churchill liked it or not, was leading it. George Patton stood before a wall-sized map of Germany at Third Army headquarters in Idar Oberstein, hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracing the blue arrows that marked Third Army's advance. In the 6 days since crossing the Rhine, his forces had punched 40 miles into the German interior, liberated Frankfurt, and were now driving toward the Fulda Gap, the historic invasion corridor into central Germany. His armor was moving so fast that supply lines struggled to keep pace. Fuel depots were being established at night and emptied by dawn. His soldiers were sleeping in their Swiss Patton's kind of war. Speed, aggression, exploitation. No pause, no consolidation. Just the relentless pressure that turned retreat into rout. But something nagged at him. Brigadier General Oscar Koch, Third Army's intelligence chief. entered the operations room carrying a sheaf of decoded German radio intercepts. Koch was a quiet man, methodical and cautious, the temperamental opposite of Patton. But, "Sir," Koch said, laying the documents on Patton's desk, "we're picking up increased Wehrmacht communications about defensive preparations around the Czech border. Looks like they're pulling back from the west and regrouping in the south." Patton studied the intercepts. "How many divisions?" "At least 12, maybe more. SS units, mostly. The kind that don't surrender easy." Patton nodded slowly. He'd been expecting this. The Third Reich was collapsing, but it wasn't dead. Hitler was reportedly in Berlin, issuing increasingly delusional orders about phantom armies and miracle weapons. But the professional German commanders, the ones still thinking, tactically, were doing what any competent officer would do. They were retreating toward defensible terrain, consolidating what remained of their forces away from the Soviets. His finger on Berlin, 300 miles northeast. Then he moved it south, to Prague, then farther south, to Austria. "They're running from the Russians," he said quietly. "They'd rather surrender to us than get chewed up by the Red Army." Koch nodded. "Intel suggests some Wehrmacht commanders are trying to surrender to American units." Patton's jaw tightened. He'd been thinking about the Soviets for weeks now longer, really. While most Allied commanders viewed the Red Army as a crucial ally grinding down Hitler's forces on the Eastern Front, a threat, a future enemy, repeatedly to anyone who would listen. He'd told Eisenhower that the Allies should keep driving east, take Berlin before the Soviets, occupy as much German territory as possible. He'd argued loudly, and often, that the war against Germany would simply transition into a cold standoff with Stalin, and that every mile of ground conceded to the Red Army, Eisenhower had listened politely, then ignored him. Because while Patton was focused on the next war, Eisenhower was trying to end this one. And ending it meant honoring the agreements made at Yalta, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had divided post-war Europe into occupation zones. Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone. Prague was on the edge. And SHAEF had made it clear. The Anglo-American armies would halt at the Elbe. Patton hated it. Hated the politics. Hated the concessions. Hated the idea of stopping when victory was within reach. But he was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. Even when those orders made no sense. "Keep me updated on the Czech situation," Patton told Koch. "If the Germans are massing there, we might need to adjust our axis of advance." Koch saluted and left. Patton remained at the map, staring at the blue arrows, thinking about roads not taken. 300 miles north, at 21st Army Group headquarters, Bernard Montgomery was having a very different conversation. His chief of staff, Freddie de Gingend, had just returned from a liaison visit to Schaeff in Reims, and the news wasn't encouraging. Eisenhower had been polite but firm. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would continue northeast toward Hamburg and the Baltic coast. It was important work. Strategic work. But it wasn't the drive to Berlin. And he had no intention of racing the Red Army for a city that would end up in their occupation zone anyway. American and British forces would stop at the Elbe, link up with Soviet units, and let Stalin have his victory parade, and argued against this decision for weeks. He believed correctly, as history would show, that Berlin held immense symbolic and political value, and that allowing the Soviets to take it would hand Stalin a propaganda victory that would echo for generations. He'd proposed a narrow front strategy, drive straight to Berlin, and end the war with Anglo-American troops standing in the Reichstag. Eisenhower had rejected the plan, too risky, too costly, and politically untenable given the Yalta agreements. Stared out the window of his command caravan. Beyond the glass, British soldiers were digging in along the northern German plain, consolidating gains, preparing for the fight. Good men, disciplined men, men who had fought from El Alamein to the but they wouldn't be the ones raising the flag over Berlin. "Freddie," Montgomery said quietly, "what's Patton doing?" "Third Army is driving east toward the Czech border. Fast, very fast. Fast, very fast. Bradley's given him a free inch, but de Gingen knew him well enough to sense the calculation behind the silence. Patton was still racing, still grabbing headlines, still pushing boundaries, while Montgomery, methodical, disciplined, professional, was being relegated to a supporting role in the war's final act. "Does Eisenhower know how far east Patton intends to go?" Montgomery asked. "I believe so, sir. But there's talk the Third Army might push into Czechoslovakia if the opportunity presents itself." "Nothing official yet." Montgomery nodded slowly. He understood now. The war was ending, but the competition wasn't. Patton wasn't racing the Germans anymore. He was racing the Soviets. And by extension, he was racing Montgomery racing to see who could claim the most territory, liberate the most cities, secure the most glory before the shooting stopped. And Eisenhower was letting him do it. Montgomery felt the old frustration rising, a sense that the Americans, for all their material superiority, lacked strategic vision. They thought in terms of advance rates and kill ratios, not political consequences. They didn't understand that wars weren't won solely on battlefields. They were won in the settlements that followed, in the maps that diplomats drew, in the narratives that historians would write. But he'd lost this argument. Churchill had sided with Eisenhower. The Americans were now the dominant force in the alliance. And no amount of tactical brilliance or operational success could change the fundamental reality that Britain's influence ended. He was being managed, politely, diplomatically, but managed nonetheless. "Thank you, Freddie," Montgomery said. "That will be all." De Gingen hesitated. "Sir, if I may, you've executed one of the most successful operations of the war. Operation Montgomery smiled faintly. "History, Freddie, is written by the winners. And I'm beginning to think the Americans have already decided what the winning narrative will be." At SHAEF headquarters, Eisenhower was dealing with yet another crisis. The Third Army's rapid advance had created a logistical nightmare. Patton's divisions were outrunning their supply lines, commandeering fuel from other units, and according to several angry reports from neighboring armies, ignoring operational boundaries in their headlong rush east. Bradley had called twice that day, asking for guidance. Montgomery had sent a terse cable noting the Third Army's advance front. And now, Eisenhower had just received word that Patton was making noise about driving into Czechoslovakia specifically, toward Prague if the opportunity stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. He liked Patton, respected him, recognized his genius for mobile warfare. But managing Patton was like managing a force of nature. You could channel it, direct it, even harness its energy. Problem was simple. Czechoslovakia was supposed to be in the Soviet sphere of influence. The Red Army was already fighting its way toward Prague from the east. If Patton rolled in from the west and liberated the city first, it would create the entire post-war settlement. Eisenhower drafted a message to Bradley. Third Army is to halt at the Czechoslovakia. Patton would hate it. Knew Bradley would have to deliver the order carefully. Knew that somewhere in Germany, George Patton was probably staring at a map right now, calculating how fast he could reach Prague before anyone told him to stop. But Eisenhower also knew this. The war in Europe was nearly over. Germany was finished. Hitler would be dead within weeks, if not days. And the most important battles now weren't being fought with tanks and artillery. They were being fought in cables between London, Washington, and Moscow, where the shape of the post-war would win every tactical engagement between here and Prague. It wouldn't matter, because the strategic decisions had already been made. Eisenhower sent the order. Then he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, feeling the weight of command settle on his shoulders like physical mass. He'd spent 3 years managing egos, balancing national interests, alliance from tearing itself apart over questions of glory and press. Patton wanted freedom to maneuver. Churchill wanted to preserve British influence. And Eisenhower, caught in the middle, just wanted the damn war to end before his best commanders started fighting each other instead of the Germans. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Rheims, artillery rumbled. The war continued. But the battles that mattered most were no longer being fought with guns. General Omar Bradley sat at 12th Army Group headquarters in Wiesbaden, reading the morning intelligence summary with the focused calm that had made him Eisenhower's most trusted field commander. The report was overwhelming in its implications. Third Army had advanced another 30 miles overnight. First Army had linked up with Ninth Army near the Ruhr, trapping 300,000 German troops in a massive pocket. And Soviet forces were now less than. The war was accelerating toward its conclusion with a momentum that felt almost surreal. Bradley set down the report and reached for his coffee, but his hand paused mid-motion. He opened it carefully. The message was brief, typed on Eisenhower's personal stationery. Brad, need you in Rheims tomorrow morning. Montgomery situation requires discussion. Bradley exhaled slowly. Also, Patton, bring your patience. Psych. He didn't need elaboration. He knew exactly what this meant. Over the Rhine crossing incident, still sending cables to London about American lack of coordination, still positioning himself as the voice of disciplined professionalism in contrast to Patton's cowboy theatrics. And Patton, predictably, was making things worse by giving press interviews in which he barely concealed his contempt for Montgomery editorials questioning American command competence. The American press had responded with pieces celebrating Patton's audacity and implicitly mocking Montgomery's ponderous preparations. And Bradley's steady, diplomatic, unflappable Bradley was being called in to help Eisenhower manage the fallout. He finished his coffee, grabbed his cap, and told his aide to prepare transport to Rheims for the following morning. Then he did something he'd been putting off for 3 days. He placed a call to Third Army headquarters. Patton answered on the second ring. Brad, tell me you're calling with good news about Prague. Bradley closed his eyes. George, we need to talk. If this is about the fuel requisitions, I can explain. It's not about fuel. It's about Montgomery. There was a pause on the line. Then Patton's voice came back, edged with amusement. What did Monty do now? Send another cable to Churchill, complaining that I'm making him look slow? George? Bradley's tone carried a warning. This isn't funny anymore. Ike's dealing with political pressure from London. The British chiefs of staff are raising questions about command unity. And every time you give an interview bragging about beating Montgomery across the Rhine, you make it harder for Eisenhower to keep this alliance functional. I didn't brag, Patton said, though his tone suggested he absolutely had. I simply stated facts. Third Army crossed the Rhine on March 22nd. Montgomery crossed on March 24th. Those are dates. Brad, mathematics. Not my fault if the truth is inconvenient for Monty's ego. Bradley pinched the bridge of his nose. The Prime Minister personally intervened to smooth things over. Do you understand what that means? Churchill, who's defending the American command structure against British generals who think we reckless, had to spend political capital protecting you. Patton was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its playful edge. What do you want me to do, Brad? Apologize? Pretend we didn't cross first? I want you to stop making this personal. Montgomery's a pain in the ass, but he's also a capable commander and a key ally. And right now, Eisenhower needs him and you focused on ending this war, not fighting each other. Another pause. Then, fine, I'll keep my mouth shut. But tell Ike that if Montgomery sends one more cable questioning my operational decisions, I'm going to drive to his headquarters and question his personally. Bradley almost smiled despite himself. I'll relay that. slightly more diplomatically. He hung up and sat back in his chair, staring at the map on his wall. The blue arrows marking Allied advances looked like a flood washing across Germany from west to east, unstoppable and overwhelming. But beneath those arrows were human beings, soldiers who trusted their commanders, commanders who answered to governments, governments that answered to broadcasts. And in that ecosystem of perception and politics, Bradley understood what Eisenhower was facing. The Supreme Commander had to balance American assertiveness with British sensibilities, had to manage egos while prosecuting a war, had to maintain the appearance of Allied under the weight of impending victory. It was an impossible job. And the next morning, Bradley arrived at SHAV-F headquarters in Reims to find Eisenhower looking more exhausted than he'd seen him in months. The Supreme Commander's office was thick with cigarette smoke and diplomatic correspondence. "Brad," Eisenhower said, "thank you for coming. Coffee?" "Already had 3 cups. What's the situation?" Eisenhower leaned back and rubbed his eyes. "Montgomery sent another message to the British chiefs yesterday. He's arguing that Patton's advance into Central Germany is creating operational chaos, and the Third Army should be placed under 21st Army Group control to restore coordination." Bradley's expression didn't change, but internally he felt his jaw tighten. He wants Patton under his command. Not officially, but that's the implication. He's framing it as a matter of operational efficiency, says the northern and central advances need unified direction. And since he's senior, he should provide it. Patton would rather resign than serve under Montgomery, so would half of Third Army's officers. Eisenhower stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. The British chiefs are backing Montgomery. They retelling Churchill that American commanders lack strategic discipline and that the final phase of the war requires a more coordinated approach. Bradley heard the unspoken subtext. The British military establishment, watching its influence wane as American divisions and American resources dominate to assert control over the alliance's direction. "What does Churchill say?" Bradley asked. "Churchill's trying to stay neutral. He supports Montgomery, but he also understands that we're providing most of the troops and most of the logistics at this point. He's not going to push Truman into a confrontation." Eisenhower turned back to face Bradley. "But he did send me a personal note, very polite, very carefully worded, essentially asking if I could manage Patton's public statements." Translation: "Shut Patton up." Exactly. Eisenhower sat back down. "So here's where we are. Montgomery wants recognition. Patton wants freedom to operate. The British want influence. The Americans want results. And I'm stuck trying to keep everyone happy while we finish this war." Bradley nodded slowly. He'd suspected as much. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to talk to Patton. Not as a reprimand, as a friend. Make him understand that the next 4 weeks aren't just about winning battles. They're about preserving the alliance that won this war. Because when Germany surrenders, we're going to need British support for the occupation, for dealing with the Soviets, for everything that comes after." "And Montgomery?" Eisenhower smiled grimly. "I'll handle Montgomery. I'm going to give him Hamburg and the Baltic coast. Its important work cuts off German forces in Denmark, prevents any last-ditch resistance in the north. I'll frame it as the critical northern anchor of our final offensive." "Which it is," Bradley said. "Which it is," Eisenhower agreed. "But more importantly, it gives him a clear objective and gets him out of Patton's axis of advance. Physical separation might be the best I can hope for at this point." Bradley understood the strategy. Eisenhower couldn't change the personalities involved, couldn't make Montgomery less prideful or Patton less theatrical, but he could manage the battle space so their egos didn't collide. "What about Prague?" Bradley asked. "Patton's been making noise about driving into Czechoslovakia." Eisenhower's expression darkened. "Prague is off limits. I've already sent orders through you to halt Third Army at the border unless I specifically authorize in advance. The Soviets are closing in from the east, and I'm not going to spark a diplomatic crisis by racing them for a city that's supposed to end up in their sphere anyway. Patton's not going to like that. Patton doesn't have to like it. He has to follow orders. Eisenhower paused, then added more quietly, I know George thinks I'm giving away territory we could take, and maybe he's right. Maybe in 20 years, historians will say we should have driven to Berlin and Prague and Vienna before the Soviets got there. But right now, Brad, I have to end this war. And I can't do that if the alliance falls apart over questions of glory. Bradley nodded. He understood. Eisenhower was making the same calculation he'd made a dozen times before, trading tactical opportunity for strategic stability, subordinating personal ambition to collective success. It was the right decision, but it was also the kind of decision that would haunt Patton and perhaps Montgomery for the rest of their lives. I'll talk to George, Bradley said. I'll make him understand. Thank you. Eisenhower reached for another cigarette, then seemed to think better of it and set the pack down. You know what the ironic thing is? Patton and Montgomery are both brilliant. Either one of them could have ended this war 6 months ago if we'd given them everything they wanted, but we couldn't. Because wars aren't won by individual genius, they're won by coalitions, and coalitions require compromise. Bradley stood to leave, but paused at the door. For what it's worth, Ike, you've done a hell of a job holding this thing together. Eisenhower smiled faintly. Tell me that in a month, when the shooting stops and we're still allies. Bradley left SHAEF headquarters and climbed into his staff car for the drive back to Wiesbaden. As the French countryside rolled past spring green and quiet, marked only by the distant thunder of artillery, he thought about the conversation he'd have to have with Patton. He'd tell him about the political pressure, about Churchill's intervention, about the need to preserve Allied unity in the final weeks of the war. But he wouldn't tell him the deeper truth, that the war they spent 3 years fighting was almost over, and the war that would follow the Cold War, though no one called it that yet, was already beginning. And in that coming conflict, the rivalries between Montgomery and Patton, between British pride and American power, would seem quaint and irrelevant compared to the struggle between East and West. But for now, in April 1945, those rivalries still mattered, because the men fighting this war were human, and humans cared about recognition and respect and the judgment of history, even when history hadn't yet decided what its judgment would be. George Patton stood alone in his private quarters at 3rd Army Headquarters in Hersfeld, Germany, staring at a photograph he'd kept pinned above his field desk for the entire campaign. It showed 3rd Army tanks rolling through the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The previous August, a moment of triumph so pure it had almost justified every sacrifice, every casualty, every agonizing decision that had brought them there. But today, the photograph felt like an artifact from a different war. His aide had delivered Bradley's message an hour ago. 3rd Army will halt at the Czechoslovak border. No advance toward Prague without explicit authorization from SHAEF. Orders effective immediately. Patton had read it 3 times, each time hoping the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something different. They hadn't. He'd crumpled the message, thrown it against the wall, poured himself a whiskey, and then after the anger burned itself out smoothed the paper, and filed it with the rest of his operational directives, because that's what soldiers did, even when those orders made no strategic sense. The sounds of 3rd Army preparing for its final push echoed through the afternoon. Tank engines turning over, supply trucks rumbling past, officers shouting coordinates, poised to drive deeper into the heart of what remained of Hitler's Reich. When Prague lay exposed and the Red Army was still days away, he was being told to stop. There was a knock at the door. Carrying a map case and wearing the carefully neutral expression of a man who knew his commander was in a dangerous mood. "Sir, Evening briefing is ready whenever you are. Tell me something, Hop, Patton said quietly. Letting the Russians take Prague? Gay hesitated. He'd served with Patton long enough to know that honest answers mattered more than comforting ones. Strategically? Yes, sir. I think we're conceding ground we could hold. But politically, Politically, we're sacrificing the future to appease Stalin in the present. Patton turned from the window, his expression hard. The Soviets are going to occupy half of Europe, and we're helping them do it. We beat the Germans back to Berlin, and our reward is watching the Red Army plant their flag on the Reichstag while we sit on our hands at the Elbe. With respect, sir, those decisions are above our pay grade. Patton smiled without humor. Everything important is above our pay grade, Hop. That's how they keep us focused on tactics instead of strategy. He walked to his desk and picked up another document, a decoded German intelligence report that Koch had delivered that morning. You know what the Wehrmacht commanders are telling their troops? They're saying, retreat west, surrender to the Americans. Whatever you do, don't let the Russians capture you. Gay nodded. He'd seen the same reports. Entire German divisions were collapsing their eastern fronts and fleeing toward American lines, preferring captivity under Patton to whatever fate awaited them under Soviet occupation. They know what's coming, Patton continued. They know the Russians aren't going to treat Germany the way we will. And they're right. Stalin's going to carve up Eastern Europe like a Christmas ham, and we're going to let him because Roosevelt and Churchill shook hands on it at Yalta. Sir? Gay's voice carried a warning. Was dangerous territory even in private conversation. Can't say it in public, can't say it to the press. He set down the German report and looked at Gay directly. But that doesn't make it less true. We're winning this war and losing the peace, Hop. And 20 years from now, people are going to ask why we stopped when we had the momentum to finish the job, right? Said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Patton wasn't wrong, but being right didn't matter if the political decisions had already been made. Anyway, Patton said, his tone shifting back to business. Maybe we can't take Prague, but we can damn sure make sure that when this war ends, Third Army is standing as far east as humanly possible, where Third Army's senior staff had assembled around the situation map. Red circles indicated remaining German strongpoints, then pointed to a cluster of towns northeast of their current position. What's the resistance looking like here? Colonel Oscar Koch stepped forward. Mixed, sir. Some Wehrmacht units are surrendering on contact. We're also seeing evidence of civilian resistance in some areas. Hitler Youth, Volkssturm militias. Patton grunted. No miracles left. Just momentum and logistics. How's our supply situation? Tight but manageable. Fuel's the main constraint. We'll need emergency resupply by air. I want Third Army moving at maximum speed until we hit that Czech border or run out of road, whichever comes first. The staff officers exchanged glances, advancing as far as possible within the letter of his restrictions while violating their spirit. It was vintage Patton aggressive, opportunistic, and calculated to force SHA-EF into either approving his gains or ordering a retreat. Sir, one of the division commanders ventured. What do we do then? Very patiently. And if some of those patrols happen to discover that Prague is lightly defended and the civilian population is begging for liberation, he let the sentence hang. Patton was going to push until someone physically restrained him. The briefing continued for another hour, dissecting targets, coordinating artillery support, planning supply routes. When it concluded, the staff dispersed to their units, leaving Patton alone once more with the map and his thoughts. He poured another whiskey and stood before the wall-sized representation of Germany's shrinking territory. Somewhere to the east, Soviet armies were grinding toward Berlin through the apocalyptic landscape of the Eastern Front. Somewhere to the north, Montgomery's 21st Army Group was methodically clearing the route to Hamburg. And here, in the center, Third Army sat poised on the edge of Czechoslovakia, restrained not by German resistance, but by Allied politics. Patton had spent his entire military career preparing for this moment, the climactic final campaign, the race into the enemy heartland, the glorious conclusion to a war fought with speed and steel and audacity. And now, at the very end, he was being told to stop not because he'd been defeated, but because victory was inconvenient. It felt like being pulled from a football game in the fourth quarter while leading by 3 touchdowns. There was another knock. This time, it was a communications officer carrying a radio message. "Sir, this just came in from SHAEF, marked urgent." Patton took the message and read it in the flickering light of the operations room's lamps. President Roosevelt died April 12, 1700 hours Eastern Time. Stop Truman, sworn in as. President stop all operational commanders. Acknowledge receipt. Stop Patton. Set down the message slowly. Roosevelt, the man who had led America through the Depression and 3 years of World War, who had shaped the alliance with Churchill and Stalin, who had made the political decisions that Patton found so frustrating, was gone. And Harry Truman, a former artillery captain and political unknown, was now commander-in-chief. Patton had met Truman once, briefly, during a Senate inspection tour of European bases. The man had struck him as competent, but cautious, a product of machine politics rather than military tradition. Whether Truman would change Allied strategy, whether he'd be tougher on the Soviets, whether he'd give Third Army the authorization to drive on Prague, of that remained unknown. But what Patton did know was this: the world was changing, and changing fast. The war that had defined the last 6 years was entering its final days. The alliance that had held together through crisis after crisis was fraying under the weight of competing national interests. And the uneasy partnership with the Soviet Union, forged in the fires of mutual need, was already showing cracks that would widen into a chasm. History was pivoting. And Patton, for all his genius and aggression, was discovering that he couldn't pivot it through force of will alone. He walked back to his quarters and sat at his desk, pulling out a sheet of paper. He began writing not an official report, but a personal letter to his wife, Beatrice. He wrote about the advance, about the German surrender, about the strange melancholy that came with approaching the end of something he'd spent 3 years fighting toward. And then he wrote something he'd never admit to his staff. "We are advancing so fast and so far that I sometimes wonder what we're advancing toward. The Germans are finished. Hitler will be dead within weeks. And then what? We shake hands with the Russians and pretend we're friends? We divide Europe into zones and hope Stalin keeps his promises? I've spent my life preparing to fight wars, B, but nobody prepared me for how to win a peace." He sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning mail courier. Outside, the sounds of Third Army preparing for another day of combat continued into the night. Tank engines shouted orders, the metallic clink of ammunition being loaded, the rhythms of an army that had fought from Normandy to the heart of Germany and wasn't finished yet. But Patton, sitting alone in the lamplight, felt the weight of something he'd never experienced before. The knowledge that victory, when it finally came, might feel less like triumph and more like compromise. 300 miles northwest, in his command caravan near Lüneburg, Bernard Montgomery was also reading the news of Roosevelt's death. He set down the intelligence brief and stared out at the darkening German countryside, processing the implications. Roosevelt had been a supporter of Eisenhower's broad front strategy, a believer in maintaining Allied unity even at the cost of individual operational brilliance. Truman was an unknown quantity, and unknowns created opportunities. Montgomery had already begun drafting a new memorandum to the British Chiefs of Staff, arguing that the transition in American leadership provided a moment to reassert British strategic influence. He would frame it carefully, not as criticism of American commanders, but as a proposal for enhanced coordination in the final phase of operations. He would suggest, delicately, that perhaps the new president might be receptive to a more unified command structure, one that placed experienced British leadership in positions of greater authority over the final drive into Germany. It was a long shot. Montgomery knew that. The Americans were too dominant now, too confident in their material superiority and operational success. But wars were won by exploiting opportunities, and political transitions were opportunities. He began writing, his pen moving across the paper with the same methodical precision he'd applied to every military operation of his career. Outside, British soldiers of the 21st Army Group settled into defensive positions along the northern German plain, consolidating gains, preparing for the push to Hamburg. Good men, professional men, men who trusted that their commander knew what he was doing. Montgomery intended to justify that trust, even if it meant fighting bureaucratic battles instead of military ones. At SHIEF headquarters in Reims, Eisenhower stood in his office long after his staff had gone to bed, smoking cigarette after cigarette and staring at the map that dominated one wall. Roosevelt's death had hit him harder than he'd expected, not because they'd been personally close, but because the president had been the political foundation upon which the entire Allied command structure rested. Now that foundation had shifted. Truman was an untested quantity. Churchill was aging and politically vulnerable. Stalin was ascendant and increasingly aggressive. And the alliance that had held together through 3 years of war was showing signs of fracture just as victory approached. Eisenhower had received 3 separate cables in the past 4 hours. One from Montgomery, requesting a strategic conference. One from Patton, asking for clarification on the Czech border restrictions. And one from the Joint Chiefs in Washington, asking how Roosevelt's death might impact operational timelines. Everyone wanted something. Everyone had an agenda. And Eisenhower, exhausted, chain-smoking, carrying the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders, just wanted the war to end so he could go home and sleep for a week. He stubbled out his cigarette and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, the lights of Reims flickered in the darkness. Somewhere out there, in the vast landscape of war-torn Europe, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were sleeping in foxholes and farmhouses and ruined buildings, trusting that their commanders knew what they were doing. Eisenhower hoped he deserved that trust. He returned to his desk and began drafting responses. To Montgomery, polite acknowledgement, promises of future coordination, no substantive changes. To Patton, firm reiteration of existing orders, praise for Third Army's achievements, subtle reminder that politics mattered as much as tactics. To the Joint Chiefs, reassurance that operations would continue as planned, that Allied unity remained intact, that victory was imminent. He wrote carefully, choosing each word to balance competing interests and fragile egos. It was past midnight when he finally finished. He sealed the messages, handed them to the night duty officer for encryption and transmission, and allowed himself to sit in silence for a moment. In 3 weeks, maybe 4, the war would be over. Germany would surrender. Hitler would be dead. The Third Reich would be consigned to history. And then the real work would begin. Managing the peace, containing Soviet ambitions, rebuilding a shattered continent, and somehow keeping the Anglo-American alliance functional despite the tensions that had nearly torn it apart. Eisenhower didn't know if he was up to that task, but he knew he'd try, because that's what soldiers did. They followed orders, carried burdens, and tried to make sense of a world that often made no sense at all. He turned off the lamp and walked to his quarters, leaving the maps and cables and cigarette smoke behind. Outside, across the landscape of Europe, the war ground toward its conclusion. Armies advanced, diplomats negotiated, politicians maneuvered, and in the spaces between battles and treaties and headlines, individual human beings, soldiers and commanders and civilians, tried to understand what it all meant. History would provide answers eventually. Historians would write books analyzing the decisions made in April 1945, debating whether Patton should have been allowed to take Prague, whether Montgomery deserved more credit, whether Eisenhower made the right calls. But in the moment, in the lived experience of men trying to end a war while preserving an alliance, there were no clear answers. Only choices made under pressure, with incomplete information and competing loyalties. Churchill's response to Montgomery's complaints about Patton hadn't been recorded in any official document. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no angry telegram, no formal rebuke. Instead, there had been quiet conversations, diplomatic pressure, and the careful management of egos that characterized high-level wartime leadership. Churchill had reminded Montgomery gently but firmly that the Americans were now the dominant partner in the alliance, that British influence depended on maintaining good relations with Washington, and that personal rivalries could not be allowed to jeopardize strategic objectives. Montgomery had understood. He hadn't liked it, but he'd understood. Patton had never known how close he'd come to being relieved. Bradley and Eisenhower had shielded him from the worst of the political fallout, absorbing the pressure from London while keeping Third Army focused on its mission. And the war had continued, grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, shaped by decisions made in conference rooms and command posts by men trying to balance glory with pragmatism, national pride with collective survival. In the end, Montgomery's Operation Plunder had been a tactical masterpiece, a textbook, river crossing executed with precision and overwhelming force. History would remember it as one of the war's most successful operations. But Patton had crossed first, and in the currency of reputation and legend that mattered just as much. Both men had won, both men had lost, and the alliance, bruised, strained, but ultimately intact, had survived long enough to finish the war. Eisenhower didn't know if he was up to that task, but he knew he'd try, because that's what soldiers did. They followed orders, carried burdens, and tried to make sense of a world that often made no sense at all. He turned off the lamp and walked to his quarters, leaving the maps and cables and cigarette smoke behind. Outside, across the landscape of Europe, the war ground toward its conclusion. Armies advanced, diplomats negotiated, politicians maneuvered, and in the spaces between battles and treaties and headlines, individual human beings, soldiers and commanders and civilians, tried to understand what it all meant. History would provide answers eventually. Historians would write books analyzing the decisions made in April 1945, debating whether Patton should have been allowed to take Prague, whether Montgomery deserved more credit, whether Eisenhower made the right calls. But in the moment, in the lived experience of men trying to end the war while preserving an alliance, there were no clear answers. Only choices made under pressure with incomplete information and competing loyalties. Churchill's response to Montgomery's complaints about Patton hadn't been recorded in any official document. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no angry telegram, no formal rebuke. Instead, there had been quiet conversations, diplomatic pressure, and the careful management of egos that characterized high-level wartime leadership. Churchill had reminded Montgomery, gently but firmly, that the Americans were now the dominant partner in the alliance, that British influence depended on maintaining good relations with Washington, and that personal rivalries could not be allowed to jeopardize strategic objectives. Montgomery had understood. He hadn't liked it, but he'd understood. Patton had never known how close he'd come to being relieved. Bradley and Eisenhower had shielded him from the worst of the political fallout, absorbing the pressure from London while keeping Third Army focused on its mission. And the war had continued, grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, shaped by decisions made in conference rooms and command posts by men trying to balance glory with pragmatism, national pride with collective survival. In the end, Montgomery's Operation Plunder had been a tactical masterpiece, a textbook river crossing executed with precision and overwhelming force. History would remember it as one of the war's most successful operations. But Patton had crossed first, and in the currency of reputation and legend that mattered just as much, both men had won. Both men had lost, and the alliance, bruised, strained, but ultimately intact, had survived long enough to finish the war.